This is part 2 of the book Titanic Disaster at Sea. Voyage Preparations. On Tuesday, April 2nd, 1912, the Titanic left dock in Belfast under the command of Edward J. Smith, the most experienced of the White Star Line's captains. She sailed down the Irish Sea to Southampton in preparation for her maiden voyage to New York, set to begin on Wednesday, April 10th. For the next week, the ship became the center of a massive activity. The finishing touches were made inside, deliveries were taken on board, and the crew was recruited. I'm not going to read over all of the provisions that were put on board and all the jobs for the crew that were on board, but if you'd like to take a minute and take a look at this text feature, you can stop the video here. All aboard. Finally, Wednesday, April 10th arrived. The crew members were all expected to be on board by 6 a.m. to attend an 8 a.m. muster and to be sure that the ship would be ready to receive the passengers, most of whom would be coming down from London by boat train. The earliest to arrive were the second and third class passengers, who had taken the 7:30 train from Waterloo Station. There were nearly 500 people traveling third class and about 240 booked into second class. Most of the third-class passengers were immigrants from Scandinavia who had crossed the North Sea on other ships. Some were single men off to seek their fortunes. Others were wives and children joining husbands who had already settled in the New World. Often whole families were traveling together with one aim, to escape poverty in their homeland and find something better in America or Canada. Many would have saved for months or even years to raise the price of their tickets. The passengers would have made their way up to the third-class gangway to be briefly checked over by a team of doctors who were particularly on the lookout for trachoma, a very infectious eye disease. No one with trachoma would be allowed into the United States, and anyone showing symptoms would be immediately turned off the ship. Everyone else was quickly directed to the sleeping quarters by the third-class stewards. The second-class passengers, meanwhile, came on board by a different gangway and made their way to the purser's office, from where they were directed to their staterooms. The first-class passengers had a much more leisurely time. Their boat train did not arrive until 11:30, just half an hour before the Titanic was due to set sail, although many would have sent their luggage and servants in advance. Nearly 200 first-class passengers embarked at Southampton. Many were wealthy Americans returning from vacations or business trips to Europe. Once again, I'm going to show you the text features on this page. It tells a little bit about a third-class passenger, the second-class passengers, and first-class passengers. If you'd like to read those, you could stop the video and find out a little more. Setting sail. At 12 o'clock sharp, the ship was ready to leave. As the last gangway was pulled away, 8 firemen who had signed on as crew but had sneaked off to a pub came dashing up. 3 of them made it on board, while the others waited for a passenger train to go by in front of them. By the time the other 5 got to the dock side, the officer guarding the gangway had decided they were too late to be let on the ship. After arguing for a while, the seamen turned away, having just missed out on 2 weeks' paid work. How do you think they felt about that when they found out what happened to the Titanic? The Titanic sounded a long blast of her whistle, and the Southampton tugboats pulled and pushed her away from the dockside, guided by the harbor pilot, George Bower. Finally, she was off. She was making her way slowly down the narrow channel toward the open sea when there was a sudden flurry of excitement. The movement of water created by her passing made a much smaller liner, the New York, break her moorings and start drifting right into the path of the bigger ship. Quick action by the captain of one of the tugs and by Captain Smith and George Warrior, who put the Titanic's engines immediately into reverse, saved the day. The 2 liners missed each other by scarcely more than a few feet. Cherbourg, France. There were no other mishaps, and soon the Titanic was in the English Channel, steaming toward Cherbourg, her first port of call. She arrived there at 6:30 in the evening, a couple of hours later than planned, thanks largely to the incident with the New York. The ship dropped anchor offshore to be met by 2 White Star tenders, small ferry boats, specifically designed for carrying passengers, freight, and mail to and from the dock. 22 passengers who were making the short journey from Southampton to Cherbourg disembarked. While they were leaving, 274 new passengers came on board, 142 first class, 30 second class, and 102 third class. They had arrived in Cherbourg on the train Transatlantic, the special boat train that had left Paris that morning. The third class passengers were a mix of nationalities, many from Eastern Mediterranean or the Near East, including Croatians, Syrians, and Armenians. With all the passengers safely stowed, the Titanic weighed anchor just after 8 p.m. and set off once more. See a couple of photographs on those pages, and one more on this page. Queensland, Ireland. At 11:30 the next morning, the Titanic stopped about 2 miles off Queenstown in Ireland to pick up the Irish mail and her last remaining passengers, a handful traveling to New York second class and just over 100 immigrants in third class. At the same time, one crew member, John Coffey, jumped ship, and 7 passengers who had booked fares from Southampton to Queenstown disembarked. One of them was Francis Brown, an amateur photographer who had spent much of his time on board taking pictures of the new ship. Into the Atlantic. At 1:30 on the afternoon of Thursday, April 11th, the Titanic headed out into the Atlantic, expected to arrive in New York on the morning of Wednesday, April 17th. She was far from full, but even so was carrying more than 2,000 people. Things seemed to have quickly settled down on board. The weather was good, and many passengers were apparently very impressed with how smooth running the Titanic was. Those on higher decks could hardly feel the vibrations of her enormous engines. There were a few glitches, of course. There was a smoldering fire in one of the coal bunkers, not finally put out until Saturday morning. And up in the crow's nest, the binoculars used by the lookouts were missing. They had apparently been there in their special locker when the ship had left Belfast, but now they were gone. Nobody knew where. Most of the passengers passed the time between meals chatting, playing cards, or reading, while the more energetic ones in first class could try out the gymnasium or challenge the ship's own professional squash player to a match. First and second class passengers could also amuse themselves by sending wireless messages to friends and family ashore, and even on other ships via one or two of the Marconi wireless operators. The outward southern track. The ship made good progress, covering more than 870 miles between midday Thursday and midday Saturday. The captain then increased the ship's speed to just under 22 knots, so that by midday on Sunday she would have covered another 545 miles. The Titanic was following the so-called outward southern track. The big steamship companies had agreed in 1899 that their westward ships would follow this route between January 15th and August 14th each year, in order to avoid areas where there was danger of encountering ice and fog. You can see the map that shows the Titanic's route. Sunday, April 14th. The fated day dawns. Although the outward southern track skirted to the south of the main sea ice areas, it was well known that icebergs were still likely to be encountered, particularly in the months of April, May, and June. Sure enough, at 9 a.m. on Sunday, April 14th, the Marconi operators received a Morse code message from Captain Barr, commander of the steamship Caronia, saying, "Captain, Titanic, westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in 42 degrees north from 49 degrees to 50 degrees west, 14th April. Compliments, Barr." This was almost exactly where the Titanic was headed. During the course of that day, half a dozen more messages containing warnings of ice ahead were received by radio operators. All messages about navigation were supposed to be passed on to the ship's captain, who should have then made sure they were posted in the chart room on the ship's bridge, so that all the officers would be able to read them. There was no proper system in place to do this, however. Some of the messages certainly did reach the captain. One from the Baltic was handed to Captain Smith at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, though not posted in the chart room until 7:15 that evening. Some, though almost certainly, never left the Marconi room. Evening falls. Even though all the messages had gotten through to them, the ship's officers knew how to be on the lookout for ice. They had an added warning since the temperature had started to drop very sharply after sunset, although there was virtually no wind. This was good, though not certain sign that there was ice around. For the first part of the evening, everything went normally. All the Titanic's boilers had been fired up, and now she was steaming ahead at over 22 knots. At 9 p.m., the captain, who had been dining with some of the first-class passengers, came to the bridge and discussed the conditions with Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who had been on watch since 6 p.m. They both agreed that the very calm sea and the fact there was no moon might make it difficult to spot any icebergs, especially ones that had recently turned over. These looked black or blue rather than white and would not show up easily in the starlight. If there had been any wind, even a slight breeze, there would have been waves lapping around the base of the bergs, following white breakers that would have been much easier to spot from a distance. At 9:30 p.m., the captain retired to his cabin in the boat deck, saying, "If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know at once. I will be just inside." These are the lookouts in the crow's nest who were supposed to keep watch for icebergs.